Imagine a battle where the rules of engagement tell you not only where to put your flag or when you can fire your biggest guns, but even if you're allowed to smoke tobacco between decks.
Right. And for centuries, the fate of entire empires literally hinged on these incredibly detailed, often top secret naval documents. They were called fighting instructions.
And these documents, they're more than just manuals, aren't they? They're like the historical DNA of naval warfare.
That's a great way to put it. They capture 300 years of tactical trial and error
Yeah.
and these just staggering shifts in technology and really in philosophy.
So today, that is exactly what we are doing. We are diving deep into that DNA. Our mission is to trace the evolution of naval battle tactics from the early 16th century, we're talking around 1530, all the way up through the age of Nelson and the final instructions of 1816.
And it's a huge journey. We're going from these loose, chaotic fights that honestly look more like land battles fought on floating castles.
Yeah.
Exactly. All the way to the rigid scientific geometry of the single line ahead formation. And then finally to Nelson's revolutionary idea of concentration.
The sources we're using for this deep dive are just incredible. A historical collection of these very fighting instructions covering nearly 300 years of commanders trying to, I guess, coordinate chaos.
And the central theme here is, well, it's absolutely crucial if you're a student of strategy. This isn't just about ships and technology, though. That's a huge part of it.
Right.
This is about how naval commanders, through political pressure, professionalization, and staggering losses, painstakingly learned how to take these massive fleets, hundreds of sails, thousands of guns, and turn them into unified, coordinated weapon systems.
It's the story of taking raw human initiative and forcing it to blend with geometric necessity. Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning, at the tactical pre-dawn. So we start around 1530. And at this point, the very idea of a formal naval formation for sailing ships was, well, it was viewed with a lot of skepticism across Europe. Why was that? Why was it so hard to believe a fleet could hold a formation?
It really boils down to the fundamental physics of the early sailing ship.
Okay.
These vessels were just clumsy. They were square-rigged, which means their maneuverability was severely limited. Tacking against the winds was this slow, agonizing process.
So not like a galley with oars where you can just point and go?
Not at all. A galley can move with precision. A large sailing warship was completely at the mercy of the wind and the weather.
So if you hit a lull or a sudden gust from the wrong direction, your whole beautiful formation just dissolves into a traffic jam.
Exactly. And commanders, they naturally questioned if imposing a rigid formation was even worth the risk of losing that individual ship mobility. Which is why the Spanish theorist Alonso de Chaves, writing around 1530, is such a pivotal figure.
Ah.
His treatise, the Espejo de Navegantes, or Seaman's Glass, directly confronts this skepticism.
Right. He's the one who argued that it was possible, and he used that fantastic analogy comparing them to war horses on land.
It's a brilliant rhetorical move. He admits their limitations, the lack of nimbleness at turning at any pace that you get with a big sailing ship, but he insists that order and formation fundamentally increase their power.
Just like organized cavalry versus a disorganized mob.
Precisely. Chaves basically said that unless there was a massive storm, in that case the storm was the battle, there was nothing stopping a fleet from holding its tactical order.
So he's making the case that a controlled collective unit is always better than just a collection of strong individuals. But he also knew that technology and tactics, they could only get you so far.
He absolutely did. Chaves argued that if you had two forces, and they were equal in numbers and in arms, the victor would be the one with superior dexterity, spirit, and fortitude.
The human element.
The human element. He actually likened naval combat to fencing. He said the weaker man who's more dexterous gives better hits than the stronger one who doesn't know the moves. For him, superior seamanship, knowing the wind, the sail, the gun, that was the ultimate unquantifiable advantage.
Okay, so let's move from the theory to the brutal reality of what an engagement looked like back then. The sources paint a picture that is almost unrecognizable to the age of sail we think of. Artillery was there, but its first job was purely psychological.
That's right. According to Chaves' thinking, you fire your largest guns first as soon as you come into range. And the goal is purely to instill dread and terror in the enemy.
Not to sink them.
Not yet. You wanted the enemy to suffer great hurt early, to damage their morale, maybe even get them to surrender or turn tail before the real fighting started. The accuracy and the rate of fire were so low that a cannonade was often more of a psychological weapon than a destructive one.
And once the fleets got closer, they basically just dropped the pretense of artillery warfare and went straight to grappling and boarding.
Yes, and this required some specialized and frankly terrifying melee weapons.
I saw the list.
I mean, when you look at the arms detailed in these instructions, you realize how medieval this fighting still was. They used harpoons, crossbows, and these absolutely visceral tools like staff sides or shear hooks.
What's a shear hook?
It's a long pole with a big blade on the end, and it was used specifically for hacking and cutting the enemy's rigging and sails to immobilize them.
And fire was a key tactic. They used fireballs, obviously, but also the infamous stink balls.
The stink balls. Yeah, that's basically early chemical warfare. They were balls packed with sulfur, pitch, other foul-smelling, noxious ingredients. The idea was to create the suffocating, choking smoke below deck.
To drive the crew out into the open.
Exactly. Drive them up onto the deck where they could be shot or just overwhelmed. It was a desperate, nasty way to clear the enemy ship.
But the detail that I found the most astonishing in all these early instructions was the special task given to armed boats once two ships were grappled together.
This is truly a shocking demonstration of just how focused naval warfare was on total destruction at the local level.
It's insane.
Yeah, detailed instructions were given to armed boats. About a quarter of the largest boats in the fleet were reserved for this. And their main job, once the grappling hooks were set and the big fight was on, was to slip away to the enemy's stern.
And their goal wasn't to board, it was sabotage.
Pure sabotage. First, they were to try and cut or jam the rudder to permanently immobilize the ship. But if they could do that and stay unseen in the chaos and smoke, they were instructed to do something unbelievable.
The augers.
Use augers-heavy wood-boring tools to drill half a dozen holes below the waterline and just scuttle the ship right there.
Wait a minute, so you're telling me the ultimate act of naval destruction in 1530 was carried out by a few guys in a rowboat with glorified hand drills? That sounds like something out of a pirate movie.
It does, but it reflects a deep truth about early naval tactics. With cannon being so unreliable and slow, physical sabotage was often the most effective way to guarantee a kill. This curious duty, as the source calls it, was a clandestine operation in the middle of a massive brawl.
Okay, so while the Spanish are theorizing about war horses and augers, the English are trying to catch up on the organization front. Lord Lisle's instructions from 1545 show the first serious English attempt at a formal battle order.
And Lisle's formation was a blunt wedge design. It was still heavily influenced by land military theory. He had to deal with the reality of a mixed fleet, proper Royal Navy ships alongside various hired merchantmen with different capabilities.
So he created this three-rank system in his vanguard, like a tactical filter, to manage that. How did that work in practice?
It was a very calculated, almost sacrificial deployment. The first rank, the one designed to take the initial shock and maybe break the enemy's formation, was made up of the heavy, robust, but often less nimble, hired Hanseatic merchant ships.
So they take the brunt of the fire.
Yes. Right behind them, in the crucial second rank, were the Royal Navy ships, the real core fighting power, with better crews and better guns.
Okay.
And finally, the third rank was made of second-rate merchantmen, ready to support or fill in gaps. This whole deployment ensured that the most valuable assets, the king's ships, were protected until the decisive moment.
And pulling this off required incredible coordination, especially when signals were so basic. The instructions said ships had to keep a precise distance, half a cable length. For us non-sailors, what is a cable length?
A cable length is roughly 100 fathoms, so about 600 feet. Half a cable length is 100 yards.
That is incredibly close.
It is. It's very tight, precise spacing to maintain in shifting winds, and it really emphasizes that they were aiming for this highly disciplined visual command structure.
And they signaled their position in the ranks using flags on different masts.
Exactly. St. George's Cross on the fore-topmast meant you were in the first rank. On the mainmast, the second. On the mizzen-topmast, the third. Visual command was the only way to make this rigid plan work. Lisle also had oared wings galleys and galleasses on the flanks, a bit like a mobile reserve, to keep enemy galleys in check. So yeah, by the mid-16th century, the English were dead serious about bringing military order to the sea, even if the final fight still involved shear hooks and augers. That whole tactical worldview we just described, where the fight ends in grappling and melee, it was fundamentally shattered by one technological development in the mid-16th century.
Let me guess. The broadside.
The perfection of the sailing man-of-war and the effective concentrated broadside was a complete game changer.
It's a massive philosophical leap, isn't it? Why bother with toxic smoke and grappling when you can disable or sink an enemy at range with a synchronized volley of dozens of heavy guns?
The broadside weapon fundamentally changed the optimal fighting position. To maximize your firepower, you had to present your side, not your bow. So this emphasis on the broadside meant individual ship mobility, the ability to swing into position. That became paramount.
And suddenly, those rigid formations like Lisle's wedge, which were designed for boarding actions.
They were suddenly obsolete. The pendulum swung back hard towards individual initiative and flexibility.
But that created a strange paradox, right? Because even with no formal battle order, the sheer logic of the broadside created an instinctive tendency that would eventually become the line ahead.
The germ of the line ahead, yes.
Yeah.
To avoid masking each other's fire, and to bring the most successive firepower onto one point, ships just naturally tended to attack one after another in a rough line.
So they didn't think of it as forming the line, it was just the smart thing to do.
It was just the most efficient way to use the new weapon without shooting your friends.
And the famous 1588 campaign against the Spanish Armada perfectly illustrates this tactical confusion. The hardware was way ahead of the tactical manual.
It's a classic example of organizational lag. You have Spanish eyewitnesses reporting that they saw the English fleet in very fine order. Some early charts even suggest the Queen's ships were trying to maintain a rough line.
But the reality of the fighting was very different.
Oh yeah. The consensus is clear. The English fleet, especially with all the armed merchantmen, fought in a loose throng.
And the result of that loose throng was just inefficiency and disorder, even though they had superior firepower.
Massively inefficient. Masked fire was common. The slower merchant ships would get in the way of the Queen's fighting ships, literally blocking the broadsides that were supposed to be their revolutionary advantage.
So they had the right weapon, but they hadn't learned how to coordinate 100 of them at once.
The tactical system hadn't caught up, which is what prompted later commanders, like Sir Walter Raleigh, to try and impose tighter organization, not through formation, but through professional discipline.
Raleigh's instructions from around 1617, they really hammer this point home, blurring the lines between military roles.
Raleigh was a visionary on professionalization. He insisted that all men must be esteemed sailors and all soldiers. He got that you couldn't have specialized units on a cramped warship. Everyone, from the guy hauling a rope to the guy firing a musket, had to be disciplined, trained, and ready for anything.
And his rules on conduct and safety, they really reveal how dangerous life on a ship was back then.
The threat of fire was constant. Raleigh had these detailed rules for fire prevention. No tobacco or candlelight between decks, except in specific cabins with lanterns. Think about that. The commander of a fleet had to police smoking to stop his ships from spontaneously combusting.
And he had zero tolerance for any internal disorder.
None. He famously noted that gamblers who could cause fights and distraction would be punished by being made a swabber of the ship, which was a menial, demeaning job. He knew ship discipline was the foundation of battle readiness.
But beyond safety, Raleigh also laid down a critical tactical rule about gunnery, which seems like a direct response to the problems of 1588.
It is a direct reaction to crews firing too soon, wasting precious powder and shot at ranges where they couldn't hit anything. Raleigh strictly forbade his gunners from shooting any great ordnance at other distance than point blank.
Now let's clarify point blank. It doesn't mean you're right next to the target, does it?
No, not exactly. In 17th century gunnery, point blank was the effective range where the cannonball traveled in a relatively straight line before gravity pulled it down. It was the distance where you could aim directly at the hull and be pretty much guaranteed a hit.
So if you can't see the whites of their eyes, save your shot.
Basically. It cemented the English fighting philosophy on decisive, close-range gunnery and moved away from that long-range terror and dread that Chaves had talked about.
So by the early 17th century, the philosophy was set. Get close, fire decisively, cause utter confusion. But they still lacked the structure to do that at a fleet level.
That's the key takeaway. They had perfected the individual weapon system, the broadside man of war. But they hadn't yet created the doctrine to unify 50 of those ships into a single cohesive weapon. That was about to be forged in the fire of the Dutch wars.
Okay, so despite that instinctive tendency to form a line, the English Navy enters the Commonwealth period without a single binding formal battle order. And that tactical gap, it quickly becomes a disaster.
The First Dutch War was the crucible, no question. The inadequacy of flexible, decentralized tactics was made agonizingly clear after the defeat at Dungeness in November 1652.
That's the battle where several English captains just failed to support their comrades, right? Or even disobeyed orders.
Yes, there was no overarching law that said how a fleet had to act when engaged. Captains felt they could make their own choices, and in the chaos of Dungeness, that led to a complete breakdown. The response was swift, absolute, and it represents one of the greatest tactical leaps in naval history.
On March 29, 1653, the generals at sea, Blake, Dean, and Monck, issue the earliest known fighting instructions in any language that formally mandates the single line ahead formation for battle.
This document is monumental. It stated that fleets were to engage in a single line ahead, one ship directly behind the next, like a column, minimizing the gap between them.
And the goal was to maximize the broadside of every single ship, all at once, without any risk of masking fire.
Or hitting your friends. And this rule was enforced with extraordinary severity. It completely eliminated individual captain discretion in favor of fleet-wide geometric precision.
Geometric science backed by military law.
Exactly. The instructions mandated that the line was to be formed upon severest punishment as soon as the fleet gained the weather station.
Okay, let's pause and define that crucial concept. The weather station. Why was getting the weather station so important that it actually triggered the mandate to form the line?
The weather station simply means being upwind of the enemy. If you're upwind, you hold the initiative, you decide when to close for action, and just as importantly, you decide when to break off.
The enemy downwind is at your mercy, essentially.
They're at a huge disadvantage. They can't easily maneuver to intercept you or to escape without a massive amount of time and effort. So the 1653 instructions basically said, once we have the power advantage, the wind, we will immediately assume the maximum combat formation, the line ahead.
Now, where did this revolutionary idea come from? Did the English develop this on their own, or did they copy the Dutch? The sources seem pretty clear it was an English innovation.
They absolutely did. The evidence strongly supports internal English development, driven by professional naval officers like William Penn and scientific military minds like Monck, who just saw the need for a system.
Right.
If you look at the Dutch orders from the time, from Tromp in 1652, for instance, they were still focused on group tactics,
Right.
Keeping squadrons close together for mutual support. It was the old, flexible system.
And contemporary accounts back this up.
They do. Dutch historians and officers themselves were constantly praising the order and precision of the English tactics and contrasting it with the confusion in their own fleet. The English were the innovators here. They forced a geometric framework onto the chaos of the sea.
The 1653 instructions also formalized the process leading up to the battle, specifically using frigates for intelligence gathering.
This is where we see the formalization of military intelligence. As soon as an enemy fleet was discovered, designated frigates, one from each squadron, were to make sail and stand with the enemy so nigh as they might conveniently.
Pure recon.
Pure recon. Their job was to figure out the enemy's formation, their number of fire ships, the overall quality of their force. They weren't supposed to get into a skirmish.
Unless they had a huge advantage.
Right. And critically, once the recon was done, the frigates were instructed to speak with each other and conclude on the report they were going to give before returning to their squadrons.
So everyone gets the same unified intelligence picture.
A standardized assessment of the enemy's posture before the generals at sea committed the entire fleet to the rigid line ahead. The line ahead wasn't just a formation. It was a military system that required advanced intelligence and strict discipline to execute.
So the single line ahead is established, but as we often see with this kind of rigidity, perfecting the geometry sometimes sacrifices the decisive moment. The tactical pendulum began to swing back almost immediately during the Restoration.
It did. The Duke of York, who later became King James II, issued instructions in 1665 that continued to build on that 1653 foundation. He was detailing signals for close action for maintaining precise station. They were trying to perfect the geometric ideal.
But after the Battle of Lowestoft in 1665, where the English won, but they didn't get that decisive, crushing victory, there is this deep sense of dissatisfaction in the Navy.
They felt the intricate maneuvering and the rigid adherence to signals, while orderly, had actually stopped them from landing the final conclusive blow. There was this growing conviction among the fighting captains that there was too much maneuvering and not enough hard fighting.
They were prioritizing the structure over the destruction.
Perfectly put. And this desire for decisive action was channeled by one of the most aggressive commanders of the era, Prince Rupert. In 1666, he introduced a truly radical mandate.
Right.
Rupert, who was joint admiral with Monck, introduced an additional instruction for fighting that was revolutionary in its simplicity. It stated that the destruction of the enemy is always to be made the chiefest care.
That is a powerful statement. It's essentially saying the goal destruction is more important than the line ahead.
It absolutely did. This instruction explicitly told captains that if their flagship or a comrade faltered or fell out of the line, their primary duty was not to maintain the perfect formation.
So what were they supposed to do?
They were instructed to make all way possible to keep up with the admiral and prioritize destroying the enemy. It legalized the temporary breach of the line for the sake of winning.
Wow. That must have created a huge amount of tension for officers trained to prize that geometric formation above all else. It sounds like a recipe for controlled anarchy.
It was a conscious recognition that tactical discipline serves decisive action, not the other way around. It anticipates Nelson's philosophy by over a century, and that flexibility was crucial, especially during the 4 days battle in 1666, which was just 4 days of brutal, chaotic, close-quarters fighting.
And the experience of those grinding battles led to another set of foundational rules in 1672, which introduced concepts that would eventually dominate naval strategy: dividing and containing.
The 1672 instructions were profound. They introduced the idea of dividing the enemy's fleet, focusing force to cut off a part of it. But equally important was the instruction to use the rest of the English fleet to prevent the remaining enemy ships from concentrating.
Preventing them from coming to help. That's the first known concept of containing an enemy in naval literature, isn't it?
It is. It meant neutralizing a superior or unengaged part of the enemy while you achieve local superiority to crush the part you'd cut off. Think of it like this. You have 50 ships. The enemy has 60. You cut off 20 of theirs. Now you use 30 of your ships to contain the other 40 enemy ships, while your remaining 20 ships destroy the 20 you've isolated. It's this powerful realization that you win by achieving local, temporary superiority.
And the need for tight discipline was underscored by the punishments. After the chaos of 1666, they came down hard on friendly fire.
Yes. After some regrettable incidents, often caused by the dense smoke and confusion, a new frightening rule was drafted. The penalty for firing over one's own ships was pain of death.
Pain of death, let that sink in. You misjudged the wind and the smoke, you accidentally hit a friendly mast, and you could be hanged. That is how fundamentally important the line ahead and fire discipline had become.
It shows how serious they were. But they also balanced that severity with incredible incentives for success, particularly for the fire ships.
Fire ships, the guided missiles of the 17th century, basically terrifying disposable weapons.
And their job was practically suicidal. So the Duke of York introduced substantial rewards. Fire ship captains who successfully burned an enemy ship of 40 guns or more were guaranteed 10 pounds cash on the spot from the admiral.
Which was a huge sum of money back then.
A massive sum, equivalent to maybe a year's wages for a seaman. Plus, they were guaranteed gold medals and promotion. And later, saving a friendly ship got you the same reward. It was all designed to encourage extreme risk and loyalty in the most dangerous job in the fleet.
So the late 17th century was marked by this radical innovation, blending discipline with decisiveness. But as we move into the 18th century, we enter what historians often call the stereotyped era, a period accused of tactical stagnation.
And the source points directly to Admiral Russell's instructions of 1691 as the origin of this stagnation. Russell's code became the standing form, and it stayed largely unchanged for nearly a century.
And that long adherence meant doctrine just failed to keep pace with the reality of fighting highly evasive enemies like the French.
And the most immediate consequence was the disappearance of that aggressive intent. That critical article from 1672 about dividing the enemy's fleet, it just vanished. The focus became almost entirely defensive.
Right. The new goal was preventing your own being broken.
Achieved by strictly ordering ships to close up any gaps created by a disabled comrade. Now, that sounds disciplined, but in practice it meant the desire for a perfect formation was more important than the desire for a decisive victory.
And this defensive mindset created the critical tactical flaw of the entire era, the problem with the standard parallel attack, especially from windward. We really need to spend some time on this because it paralyzed commanders for decades.
This is the absolute crux of the problem that led to so many indecisive battles in the 18th century. It was a system that could let you win a battle tactically, but forbid you from winning it decisively.
So the standard method was to run down parallel to the enemy line and engage ship for ship. What happens if the battle goes well and one part of your line defeats their opposite number?
This is the trap. If you try to pursue your advantage, Say you follow the defeated enemy ships to cut them off, or you bear down on the next enemy ships in their line, you are forced to break your own line.
And by breaking your own line, you expose your victorious squadron to a dangerous counterattack from the rest of the enemy fleet.
A counter-concentration. So the very act of trying to complete the victory was defined by the rules as breaking discipline and exposing yourself to defeat. It was a strategic checkmate imposed by the rules themselves.
So commanders like Admiral Byng, who was later executed,
Yes.
they were often paralyzed by the very instructions they were required to follow. The fear of being court-martialed for breaking the line was greater than the ambition for victory.
Which is what drove a few innovative theorists to advocate for a hazardous alternative, the oblique attack.
Okay, what was that?
Instead of running down parallel to the whole enemy line, they suggested bearing down on just the enemy's van, or their weathermost ships, in a line that was oblique to the enemy's line. So you're approaching at an angle.
The goal being to gradually roll up the enemy's line from the front.
Exactly. You could concentrate superior force on the ships at the point of attack without ever disturbing the order of your own line, which just kept feeding fresh ships into the fight. It was a clear precursor to Nelson's ideas.
But it was also incredibly risky.
Extremely risky. It exposed your whole fleet during the approach. If the enemy commander was disciplined, they could just pour concentrated fire on your lead ships and cripple the whole attack before it even began. It was high risk, high reward, and the cautious standing orders actively discouraged it.
So since the standing code was so rigid, innovation had to happen on the margins through additional fighting instructions issued by specific admirals.
These were the lifeblood of tactical progress. For example, Admiral Anson introduced the line of bearing, or quarter line, around 1747.
What exactly is a line of bearing in simple terms?
Imagine your ships aren't sailing straight ahead in a column, but they're all angled slightly away from the direction of travel, usually 45 degrees. They maintain their positions relative to the admiral, but they're angled so that when the command is given, they can all turn and bear down on the enemy simultaneously.
Instead of the whole column having to slowly turn one by one.
Right. Anson also pioneered formations in two separate lines, which set the stage for later concepts of concentration.
And then there was Admiral Hawke, who introduced more elasticity in 1756.
Hawke addressed the time-wasting aspect of the line. He suggested replacing the old rule of strictly following your leader with the principle of each ship steering for her opposite in the enemy's line.
So no more waiting around.
No more waiting. If there's an enemy ship opposite you, your job is to close and engage, force the action, force a decision.
And all of this intellectual ferment, it finally culminates in 1782 with Admiral Rodney's famous and famously debated maneuver at the Battle of Les Saintes.
Where he just broke the French line.
He broke the line.
And Rodney's success was instantly recognized as the moment the old order shattered. Whether it was accidental or planned, the effect was profound. His successors, Hood and Piggott, immediately started drafting new signals to institutionalize breaking the line. But in doing that, they had to understand its purpose. Which brings us to the crucial difference between Rodney and Howe. We've hit a point of historical nuance here that often trips people up. It's really critical to understand that there were two fundamentally different tactical intentions behind the general idea of breaking the line.
Okay, so let's define Rodney's method first, the one from 1782, Les Saintes.
Rodney's maneuver involved breaking through the enemy line. But the key instruction was for the following ships to preserve a close line ahead formation to support the ship that made the cut.
So it's a team effort.
A team effort. And the primary intention was tactical, to cut off part of their van or rear. It was a maneuver best used when attacking from leeward, where you needed to get the wind of the ships you cut off to force them into a decisive, contained fight.
Now let's contrast that with Admiral Howe's approach, which he perfected a decade later in the early 1790s. What was his strategic goal?
Howe's method, which he first signaled in his 1790 code, was about passing between the enemy's ships to engage them to leeward. His goal wasn't just to cut off a segment, it was to defeat a specific, evasive French tactic.
And that tactic was their disciplined practice of continually falling off to leeward during a battle.
Exactly. The French would disengage by bearing away slightly, right? Which forced the British to pursue them, and in doing so, expose themselves to dangerous damage.
How so?
As the French fell off to leeward, the British ships, usually closing from windward, had to bear up to keep pace. When they did that, they exposed their masts and rigging to what was known as raking fire aloft.
Raking fire is when a cannonball travels the full length of a ship. So what's raking fire aloft?
It means the French were aiming high, hitting the masts, the yards, or the rigging, Their goal wasn't to sink the British ships, it was to immobilize them. By forcing the British to bear up and expose their rigging, the French ensured the British could never get close enough for the decisive, hull-smashing duel that the British preferred.
So Howe's breakthrough was designed to pass through the line, place the British fleet on the leeward side, and essentially pin the enemy against the wind, forcing that close-range gunnery duel they couldn't escape.
It was a brilliant strategic counter-tactic aimed at neutralizing French evasion, fundamentally different in purpose from Rodney's simpler cut. Howe's instructions were designed to force a decisive outcome by fixing the enemy's position.
And during this period of innovation, Howe also briefly experimented with an older tactical idea, doubling.
Yes, he reintroduced signals for doubling engaging a single enemy ship from both sides. He borrowed it from the French tactician pair Host. And on the surface, it seems logical. 2 ships against 1.
Sounds like a winning formula.
It does. But it was quickly criticized by perceptive British officers, like Admiral Sir Charles Knowles, around 1780.
So how does being caught between 2 ships actually help the enemy? That sounds completely counterintuitive.
It all comes down to the geometry of crossfire. Knowles argued that doubling was actually inefficient. By engaging one enemy ship with 2 of yours, you rendered your inner ships useless because they couldn't fire their disengaged broadside. Meanwhile, the single enemy ship, positioned perfectly between 2 opponents, received favorable crossed fire.
Favorable.
Yes. So if the enemy ship fired its port side at your ship A and its starboard side at your ship B, the cannonballs fired by your ships A and B would cross right over the enemy's deck.
And potentially hit each other.
Exactly. Knowles believed that if the French were disciplined and aimed slightly high, the British ships were at serious risk of hitting each other in the smoke and chaos. And that's why doubling didn't last in British standing orders, despite its intuitive appeal.
So we've traced this evolution from disorganized brawls to geometric lines, and then to the necessary but highly contested idea of breaking that line. And all of this tactical thought, all this trial and error, it all culminates in the work of one man, Horatio Nelson.
Nelson's tactical memoranda, especially the ones leading up to Trafalgar in 1805, they represent the absolute zenith of sailing ship tactics. He moved way beyond the debates about geometry and focused entirely on the outcome: massed concentration and annihilation.
He simplified all those complex debates into 3 core principles that really formed his command philosophy.
First, he insisted on breaking the fleet into distinct divisions, 2 or 3. Second, and this is critical, he gave divisional leaders independent command and control. He trusted their professionalism. And third, he mandated that the main attack would be concentrated on the enemy's rear or center. He moved command from a single voice dictating the line to a decentralized, highly professional system.
And his plan for Trafalgar, the 1805 memorandum, was the ultimate expression of this strategy.
An elegant brutality. He intended to attack in 2 major columns, led by himself and Vice Admiral Collingwood. Collingwood's column, the Lee Division, had the decisive task to attack the enemy's rear and effectively crush the last third of the Franco-Spanish line with overwhelming force.
And Nelson's own column, the Windward Division, wasn't for the primary killing blow. It was for that principle we met back in 1672, containing.
Exactly. Nelson's column was explicitly intended to cover or contain the enemy's van and center to stop them from turning downwind to help their rear. By keeping them occupied and uncertain, he guaranteed that Collingwood's division achieved a local, overwhelming numerical superiority right where the decisive blow would be struck. It was a perfect application of concentrated force.
But despite all that meticulous planning, the true brilliance, what they called the Nelson touch, was rooted in tactical ambiguity at the moment of execution.
Yes. Nelson chose to approach in a perpendicular line ahead, which was a risky formation that exposed his leading ships, the Victory and the Royal Sovereign, to massive raking fire because they couldn't bring their broadsides to bear.
But by holding that formation, and by keeping his final breaking point ambiguous until the last possible moment, he achieved that psychological paralysis we were talking about. He famously said, "They won't know what I'm about."
This is the genius of calculated uncertainty. Collingwood, leading the other column, signaled the line of bearing, so his objective, the enemy rear, was absolutely clear. But Nelson, holding his course toward the center, kept the combined fleet guessing. Was he aiming for the center? Was he planning a massive simultaneous break?
So if the enemy van bore down to help the rear, they exposed themselves to being cut off by Nelson's column. But if they held their station,
the rear was guaranteed to be crushed before they could possibly interfere. The ambiguity immobilized the unengaged part of the enemy fleet. They stuck to their own rigid defensive rules, waiting for Nelson's final move. and that waiting cost them the battle. Nelson sacrificed the momentary safety of his lead ships for the strategic paralysis of the entire enemy fleet.
It's the highest form of tactical chess. But the sources reveal a final, painful irony in this whole journey of learning.
Oh yes, post-Trafalgar, the British Navy struggled immensely to institutionalize Nelson's success. Admirals like Gambier and Collingwood tried to integrate the Nelson touch into official doctrine, but the nuance of containing, concentration, and decentralized command was just lost in translation.
And this failure of institutional learning is captured perfectly in the official signal book of 1816, the last word of British sailing tactics that closes our timeline.
It contained what the source calls an inexplicable blunder. The signal book included a signal for Rodney's method of breaking the line, but it incorrectly instructed the following ships to engage the enemy ships ahead of the break.
Instead of following the cutter to support the part they'd cut off.
Right, it's a massive failure of strategic comprehension. It turns a planned concentration on the rear into a confusing attack on the center and van, which precisely neutralizes the whole advantage of the initial cut. And even worse, the 1816 code, in trying to capture Nelson's genius, completely missed the core principles of concentration and containing. They essentially codified the recklessness of the perpendicular attack without the strategic rationale or the decentralized philosophy that made it work.
A textbook case of institutional failure right at the very end of the age of sail. The journey we've taken today from the early 16th century all the way to the post-Nelson era is just astonishing. We started with ships fighting like land cavalry, fearing friendly fire, and using specialized teams with augers to scuttle enemy ships under a cloud of smoke.
And we ended with this complex, highly professional system of fleet command that demanded precision, coordination, and a professional officer corps capable of executing decentralized plans, or, in Nelson's case, having the courage and trust to abandon the rules entirely to win.
And the line-ahead formation, which defined this whole era, it wasn't a tactical flaw, was it? It was a necessary organizational foundation. It provided the structure you needed for massed, controlled firepower.
It was the scientific framework needed to coordinate these vast, complex resources across an inherently chaotic medium, the open ocean. But the true strategic success, it belonged to those few great admirals. From Rupert insisting on the destruction of the enemy, to Hawke personalizing the attack, all the way to Nelson.
They were the ones who recognized when that geometric ideal had to be shattered for the sake of the objective.
They understood that doctrine exists to serve the mission, not the other way around.
So, as you reflect on this 300-year journey from augurs to admirals, consider this final thought. The 1816 signal book tried to define the Nelson touch with rigid signals and specific formations. But given the century-long effort to control and coordinate fleets in a single, unyielding line, maybe the actual genius of the Nelson touch was less about the geometric point of attack and more about achieving such psychological dominance that the enemy's own rigorous defensive adherence to their rigid rules became the final, fatal trap.
Immobilizing the enemy through strategic uncertainty. That's a lesson in organizational strategy and leadership that holds true in any complex, high-stakes environment, whether you're commanding a fleet or, a modern corporation.